Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased that Paul ended with that quote because I was planning to start my talk by saying that on the wall of St. Paul's Cathedral, the epitaph to Wren is Lector si monumentum requiris circum specie. And I was going to suggest that it could equally well have said si monumentum requiris circum audi. Now, I apologize for my cod Latin. As a result of the vicissitudes of the timetabling at the Welsh Valley Grammar School I attended, I wasn't able to study Latin, I had to do woodwork. So my declensions are terrible, but my dovetailing is immaculate. The reason I gave the alternative epitaph, and interestingly, people have always assumed that that epitaph on the wall of St. Paul's is an indication of Wren's modesty, that he didn't want a monument. It's probably more likely that his son and friends wished to save a bob or two and thought a written epitaph would probably be a lot cheaper, because Wren wasn't short on ego, and I suppose that's something I have in common with him. Wren was a great man for the opportunity as it arose in the heat of the moment. And when I talked about listening around you, I wanted to indicate the importance of Wren's acoustics. And I had planned to give this evening's talk without amplification, because Wren's buildings always have wonderful acoustics. And if for a moment I stand in front of the microphone and try to address you, you will see that this building doesn't have very good acoustics. Unless you're lip readers, you probably can't understand what I'm saying. So that idea had to be dropped. And there's a very good reason these aren't Wren's acoustics. As you heard at the outset, the church interior is not Wren's. Wren built the building. Of course, it was bombed in the war and had to be rebuilt. And the reason the acoustics don't work terribly well is that the galleries have gone, and those galleries used to contain the sound and project the sound in just the right directions. And the other thing is that the plasterwork is modern and probably considerably less absorbent than the old plaster would have been. So the reverberation time would have been very different. There would have been less echo. So I wasn't able to show you just how good Wren's acoustics can be, but in most of Wren's buildings, the acoustics are superb, with the one exception perhaps of that dreadful echo when you're underneath the dome in St. Paul's. And anyone who's been to an orchestral concert in St. Paul's and has had the misfortune to sit under, I should say, or very close to the dome, will realize what strange echoes can develop and how you can find the percussion in the middle of the violas and the trombone coming out of the place where the harp sits. Very strange. And I know from my days in youth orchestra how odd it is when you're playing in an orchestra under a dome, because the only person you can hear is yourself. The whole of the rest of the orchestra disappears. So apart from that dome, Wren's acoustics are very good. Wren had a wonderful understanding of space. And I suppose that's not surprising, because after all, he was an astronomer. Slightly cheap jibe, I suppose, but he was a man of many parts. He was a Cambridge professor in mathematics and astronomy. He started his career as a professor. I'm ending mine as a professor. We've done it the other way around. He taught and then practiced, and I've perhaps done it in the opposite direction. The other thing is about Wren, if they'd had air miles in those days, he would have racked up more air miles than anybody else on the Cambridge to London stagecoach, because there was rarely an opportunity where he didn't get on the stagecoach and come down to London to see if there was an opportunity that he could make something out of. He had an amazing reputation for taking ideas to the king, not always his own ideas. If you read the writings of Hooke and some of his other scientific friends from the Royal Society, you will realize that they were very suspicious of Christopher Wren and tended to change what they were talking about whenever he came into earshot, because he had a tremendous habit of disappearing off to the palace with his latest idea, which was quite frequently somebody else's. Nevertheless, he was a great man for doing things. And he almost got his way with most of the things he wanted to do in the city. In 1665, he escaped the plague in London by taking a trip to Paris, where he hung out with the likes of Bernini and Mansard, the inventor of the mansard roof. He apparently had a great time in Paris, but he obviously didn't waste that time, because he came back to London with lots of ideas, many of them architectural. And I think it was at that time that he realized that teaching mathematics and astronomy in Cambridge were perhaps less fulfilling than other things he might do. When I was appointed city planning officer, one of the first things I did was to treat myself to a little present. At that time, there was a print shop near to the Guildhall, and I remember coveting something in the window of that print shop. It was a limited edition print by a Kent artist called Graham Clark, and it was one of his English history series. It depicted a view of the old medieval city of London from a mythical hill somewhere south of the river. And as you looked down from this mythical hill, you saw the name Ye River Thames spelt out in capsized sailing vessels on the water, and beyond it, the timbered city of London. But on the hill, closest to the viewpoint, there was a sedan chair on the right-hand side with King Charles and Nell Gwyn diverting themselves with an interest other than the view. And to the left, there were a group of rather moronic people in tall white hats and white overalls with wooden spoons in their hand. And in the middle, a large drawing board, and on it, a large sheet of paper which bore nothing other than the crest of the City of London, the coat of arms of the City of London, Domine Dirige Nos, which, as I always used to tell people in Latin, is Lord lead us. But to the city corporation, we always used to say it meant God help us. That was the coat of arms on the sheet of paper, nothing else. And in front of the drawing board, Sir Christopher Wren and one of his assistants, about to start drawing on that large sheet. So there's Christopher Wren, about to plan a new city, and there's the old city still standing. But it's all explained by the caption, explaining this group of moronic people on the left in the tall white hats. Because instead of being called the bakers, it's called the fireworkers. Now, I'm amazed that nobody's researched the implication and involvement of Sir Christopher Wren in the Great Fire of London. He was the only one that had anything to gain from that fire. And one has to ask oneself whether he might have had some tangential involvement. But nevertheless, as we know, the city did burn down, and not surprisingly, because the city has always bounced back more strongly after a disaster, the city did in fact bounce back, but with help from rather a large number of people. And a little hindrance. Within hours, we are told, Wren was on the Cambridge coach, down to London to see the King with his new plan for the City of London, for rebuilding the city after the fire. A wonderful plan based on what he had seen in Paris. A wonderful plan of a great city with boulevards, a great city that was already a fine city long before Haussmann got hold of it, a city which very much believed in axial planning, in Beaux-Arts planning, even in those very early days. The Reformation had got there. And, the Renaissance, I should have said, had got there. The image that was presented was of a very formal classical city. Bernini had obviously had his influence upon Wren. And Wren was somewhat taken aback when, in spite of the support of the King, the city fathers and the livery companies and the property owners in the city were less than enthusiastic. Now, anybody that understood the City of London would have well known that the worst person you could have sided with to get support in the city was the monarch. For those of you that aren't aware of the fact, the monarch has no right of entry to the City of London. The Normans didn't invade the square mile. They built the Tower of London just outside to the east and Baynard's Castle just outside to the west because they recognised a good going concern when they saw it. And their idea was to tax it, keep an eye on it, and let it carry on doing its good work. And from that day to this, the King or Queen has no right to come into the City of London without the permission of the Lord Mayor, which is why the Queen's coach or car has to stop in Fleet Street, a few hundred yards away, at the site of the old Temple Bar, and the Lord Mayor has to meet the monarch and place his sword of office inside the vehicle before she can proceed. So the whole idea of Wren going to the king to gain support for replanning the city was, shall we say, at the very least flawed and likely to bring the negative reaction from the city fathers. The other thing was that the city was in rather a hurry to rebuild. It wanted to be a going concern again. It didn't want the hold-up of planning legislation. It was a bit like the current Tory government. It felt planning got in the way, rather. And if it was left to market forces, things would work an awful lot better. Sorry, quicker. Certainly don't work better. But the city fathers and the owners of the land wanted to rebuild on their existing sites. They didn't want grand avenues being built. They didn't want things lined up and axial. They wanted the old medieval street plan returned. And Wren didn't get his way. A few months ago, I moved into a new flat, and rather than that image of Wren and the fireworkers, which I used to live with, I now have a new image on the wall at the foot of my bed, which I see when I wake up every morning. And that's an imaginative interpretation in 3 dimensions, an aerial view of Wren's plan of the city if it had been built, populated with Wren's buildings. And I have it there as a horrible warning of what would have happened to the City of London had Wren had his way. The city would not have been able to continue to adapt in the way that it has done over the hundreds of years since Wren's time if it had had a formal Beaux-Arts plan. If it had been more like Paris, it would, like Paris, not be a world city, because it would have lacked that ability to adapt. The secret to planning a place like the City of London is to recognise what already works. If you're going to plan a business centre, you first have to find out where people gossip. In the City of London, they gossip in the bars, in the restaurants, in the coffee houses, in the alleyways, in the small spaces, in the medieval grain of a city that has been a business centre for 2,000 years. Ever since a couple of shiploads of sex-starved Roman sailors ran aground in the Thames and founded the City of London, it has been a place where people have partied and gossiped. And that's great as a centre for business. It's the sort of thing that attracts people to do business, the thought that they can come together with other people and have fun and make money. Those are the 2 things they like to do at the same time. And to this day, London attracts 20 and 30-somethings from all over the world because of the wonderful party it offers. Coincidentally, they come to work here, but they get the job to pay for the party. And we happen to have them at the time when they're at their greatest intellectual strength. So London gets the benefit out of all these young people that pass through. If you started with a clean sheet of paper, as Wren was planning to do, then you would create a development, but you wouldn't create a place, because a place is dependent upon the interaction of people with spaces and the continued interaction of people with spaces. The gossip has to percolate into the stone and into the brick and into the other building materials before it becomes a real place. That's why Canary Wharf is yet to become a place, why Milton Keynes is so lacking, why La Défense doesn't make Paris a world city. These are developments, they're not places. To plan a place, you have to approach the urban form as if you were approaching a garden. Imagine you've bought a house, an old house with a very unkempt garden. There are two ways of approaching that garden. The way that many architects would do it, and I'm allowed to say that as I am an architect, and that would be to go in with a flamethrower, clear the whole lot, build a patio, and lay it all out, plan it. And there's the other way, and that's to go out into the garden and look at the plants that are apparently doing well, maybe clear away some of the other plants that are choking them from around to give them more space, and to work with what the plants are doing in the garden. Also to find some of the species that aren't doing very well and don't seem to be very much at home, and to try weeding a few of them out and replacing them with alternative species. Work with the place or with the garden, work organically, and you're more likely to be successful because you're learning from what already exists. Exactly the same in the City of London. It would have been impossible to have planned or replanned the City of London successfully over the last 3 decades without lots of constraints. Constraints are wonderful for a planner. If we take a musical analogy for a moment, Mozart wrote wonderful music while following all of the rules of classical composition. He bent them a little along the way, but he didn't break the rules. And yet he produced music that's unique and couldn't be believed to be by any other composer. On the other hand, in the early 20th century in Vienna, Schoenberg and his friends tore up all the rules, made a new set of rules, and started writing serial music, where they had a rule that required them to use every one of the 12 semitones in order, in a tone row. And not surprisingly, that music is somewhat more difficult to appreciate, because the rules that they were using were brand new. They hadn't had time to be tested. They hadn't been modified over generations. They hadn't had the raw edges knocked off. So you have something that's new and different, but not necessarily very attractive or very conducive to entertaining you. The same with places. Places need generations to have the rough edges knocked off. I remember the wonderful landscape architect Dame Sylvia Crowe being invited to re-landscape the quad at Downing College in Cambridge. And she was engaged by a committee of dons. She came to visit them and they asked her for her initial ideas, and she said, well, she wanted to think things through carefully. She would show them examples of her work elsewhere, but she hadn't yet decided how she would approach the project, but she could assure them that it would be something that would be very suitable and would be unique. And they'd heard of her reputation and they trusted her. Dons being dons, in those days, went away for the summer vacation. Of course, nowadays we have to do summer schools and work very hard, I assure you, so we don't get any of that sort of lengthy summer vacation. But in those days, they went off. And when they came back, they were rather horrified to find that Sylvia Crowe was no longer in evidence, but that the quad was grassed from side to side. Just grass, nothing else. So they asked for another meeting, and they said to Dame Sylvia, we've paid you a really rather generous fee, and we're somewhat perplexed to see that all you've given us is grass. We were hoping for maybe the odd shrub or flower bed or paving or, well, something. And she said, oh, I haven't finished yet. And they said, well, when will you be finishing? She said, oh, next summer. And they said, oh, you're going to be working right through the year? She said, no. She said, I won't be coming back until next summer. And they said, well, what happens in the meantime? She said, well, people use the space, of course. She said, by next summer, I'll be able to see where people want to walk. There'll be paths across the grass. And then I can start landscaping it. She couldn't landscape that space without constraints. She needed to know what people needed. She needed to know where the desire lines were. In those pre-computer days, the best way to do it was to lay it all down to grass and let the students find their own routes. Much the same with planning a city. And that's a point where I've always been very grateful to Christopher Wren, because although he didn't have his way in planning the city, he did leave behind him a considerable number of constraints that have helped to shape it and to constrain what can happen within it. The building of St. Paul's Cathedral, after the fire of London, was a demonstration that the city was re-emerging, marking its skyline again with the tallest building in London. As they used to say on the commentaries on the riverboats as they passed the steps to St Paul's, I used to stand at the pub at the Founder's Arms on the South Bank, and every 5 minutes somebody would say, and the height to the top of the dome is 365 feet. That's 1 foot for every day of the year. Excuse the Cockney patois, it's my Welsh accent coming out again. But it was London's tallest building, and not surprisingly, it was in London's richest area. It wasn't built that tall because people were very religious. If you look back to the medieval period, the churches in the Cotswolds, the churches in East Anglia, all had their towers and spires extended or added onto the top. And the reason? They'd suddenly become very rich. They were doing rather well out of the wool trade, thank you very much. And each village wanted to extend their church. Not because they'd suddenly decided they should thank the Almighty for their good fortune, but because they wanted to show off to the next village. They were marking their territory. And in an even bigger way, that's what the city were doing with St Paul's Cathedral. They were marking their territory, marking their skyline with their achievement. Not that different from what happens today, albeit with a cluster of secular buildings in the eastern part of the city, the cluster of towers. If you look at post-fire engravings of the city from the South Bank, you would be impressed to see a city of skyscrapers. Because Wren's parish churches, each one of them trying to show off to the neighbouring parish, were very tall buildings in relation to the 2- and 3-storey houses and commercial premises in between. They were skyscrapers of their day. And so when people say tall buildings are not appropriate within London or within the City of London, I take issue with that. What is important is that if you're going to build tall buildings within the city, that they should be in the locations where they're going to do less harm. I regarded tall buildings in the city as a last resort. There are many places around the world that have built tall buildings in the hope that it will improve their economy. It's never turned out to be true. Frankfurt in the 1980s was a quiet market town, and it had aspirations to be Europe's financial centre. So they produced a master plan in good German style, a very thoroughly prepared master plan. It took them 5 years to produce. And they built their master plan of towers. The place was nicknamed Manhattan. And what is Frankfurt today? Today it's a quiet market town with skyscrapers. It's made not one jot of difference. People don't want to work in Frankfurt because it's boring. It's a place where people get into their cars at 4:30 in the evening and drive out into the villages in the hills, which is where they live. They abandon the city, and by 8 in the evening there's no life there at all. A bit like the City of London used to be up until the mid-80s. All the pubs shutting at 8:30 in the evening, everyone rushing off to the suburbs. Do you remember those images of the city from the 80s? Bowler-hatted men, and it was only men, tramping across London Bridge in the morning rush hour, that telephoto shot, heads down, tramping into work, just like the slaves that you see at the start of Metropolis by Fritz Lang. They looked really miserable. And the shot they never showed you, 5 o'clock in the evening, where they ran back over London Bridge to get on the train to go home to the suburbs, because in those days the suburbs were more fun than the city. I quickly realised when I was given responsibility for planning in the city that we had to do two things. One was to accommodate all of the banks from all over the world that wished to be accommodated within the square mile following the deregulation of financial services. But the other thing was we had to make it enough fun for people to want to work here. And 3 decades on, the image that the television companies use of the city is more likely to be the view from Tate Modern, looking across the Millennium Bridge towards St Paul's and a cluster of modern towers to the right on the skyline, with tourists flooding into the city for the pleasure of being there. Now, I think that's indicative of the way that the place has changed. It's moved from being simply a workplace to a place in which to do business, a true place, a place that has nightlife, a place that has shopping, a place that has hotels, and has all of the facilities for a proper connected business location. It's popular with people to come and work here and even to come for leisure. All of that is to do with making places, and the simple definition of a place is space plus people. Architecture is the icing on the cake, but it won't achieve anything unless you make a good cake in the first place. I spent a whole hour preparing for this talk this evening, which by my standards is a great deal of time. I normally just stand up and open my mouth. I'm a Welshman. But this evening I thought I'd better give some thought to what I was going to say. So I walked around St. Paul's Cathedral and through Paternoster Square. And I thought how important it was to have both of them. That St. Paul's Cathedral was wonderful. It was not only a fine piece of architecture, but it was the source of the constraints in terms of the protected view corridors that go out from it, that had helped to shape the rest of the city, and it placed some sort of cap over large parts of the city in terms of the height to which it could be developed. But next door to it was this wonderful room that is Paternoster Square, where tourist and banker and people just passing through all come together and meet. My first remembrance of the city, my first memory of the city, my second memory I should say, my first was 13 years of age, top deck of a number 15 bus coming down Fleet Street, sitting in the front of the bus with my parents as a tourist coming to London for the first time. That was my first entry into the city. The Lord Mayor was not there to put his sort of office on the floor of the bus. I had to make it all by myself, but there we are. Little did I think I would ever have any involvement in the place, but I did fall in love with it. And during my teenage years, I was lucky enough, my father's sister moved to London and lived in Blackheath, and I was able to come for holidays. I would accompany her on the commuter train in the morning to Blackfriars. She would go to her office in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and I would head off through the alleyways of the city and fall in love with the place. So, of course, there was only one place I wanted to go to university. It had to be London. And by that stage, I was studying mathematics, physics, and art. And I was told, well, you've chosen a very odd collection of A-levels. There's only one thing you can do now, and that's architecture. Architecture it was to be then. And the place to do it was London. And I managed to get a place at the Bartlett School of Architecture, my alma mater, to which I've recently returned as a professor. The wonderful opportunity of coming to London was joy in itself. The very first project, we were divided into groups and sent to different parts of London to study how they worked as places before we were allowed to start designing buildings. Just the way to educate architecture students. And I was put into a group which, ironically, was sent to Paternoster Square. Now, I didn't realize at the time, and I probably didn't pay enough attention, but of course I should have done, because in my real career I had to sort out the real problem. So it only goes to show how much attention you should pay when you're being educated. You never know when it might come in useful. But I remember visiting that 1960s Paternoster Square, raised off the ground. You had to go up steps to get into it. It was windswept. All the buildings were on a grid plan, and it bore no relationship at all to the cathedral and its alignment. It was designed to be connected into an upper level walkway system to spread through the whole of the city, because at that time the planners thought we should replan the city and separate pedestrians from traffic. All the pedestrians would be on the upper level walkways, well out of the way of the traffic, so they didn't get in the way of the cars. There seemed to be a slight flaw in the argument, because pedestrians occasionally need a taxi or a bus, and there do need to be points where the two come together. And I'm pleased to say that subsequently we've seen more sense and realised that the important thing is to slow down the traffic enough to make the streets safe. And I've been pleased to be able to demolish a considerable number of those bits of upper level walkway that of course were never completed during the last 30 years. But this area right next to St. Paul's Cathedral had been replanned after the war into this new international style of architecture and planning. It could have been anywhere. Completely anonymous, nothing to do with making places, and people didn't go there. At lunchtime, you'd have a few desultory drinkers sitting outside one of the pubs. If the sun was shining, it rarely was. And when it rained, of course, nobody wanted to pass through it. People didn't pass through anyway, because you had to go up a flight of steps through the space and then down another flight to get out again. When it came to replanning it, and when we had the opportunity to do that in the early 90s, the first thing I realized was that we had to bring that space back down to ground level. We had to connect it into the place again. We had to allow people to percolate through the space. We had to make it permeable. And at the same time, we had to make it somewhere worth visiting, somewhere where people would pause, somewhere where people would go to meet other people. And the brilliance of the master planning that achieved the actual shape of that space through William Whitfield, a former surveyor to St. Paul's Cathedral, is to have captured those elements within that space. Right next to the cathedral, with a chapter house and a few other buildings in between, but not so high that you can't see the cathedral, you have the secular and you have the religious on either side of those buildings. You have the two different ambiances side by side, and both giving great pleasure. Parties of French school children sitting on the pavement having their packed lunch. As I say, the office workers coming out at lunchtime or in the evenings, enjoying the bars around the perimeter. It is a room of the place, and it almost doesn't matter how good the buildings are that surround it, provided the place works well. If you have good architecture as well, that's a plus. That is the icing on the cake. But getting the spaces right is the most important thing. And as a planner, albeit an architect planner, it's a space like that that gives me the greatest pleasure. Much more pleasure than having been part of the team that worked on the Gherkin and changed people's minds about modern architecture in the city. More pleasure than perhaps being involved in the replanning of the city that led to the Broadgate development, which showed what you can do in buildings that are no taller than 10 stories without having to build skyscrapers. But we did build a cluster of towers at the end, once we'd run out of enough sites to build ground scrapers. And we did it in a tight cluster in the eastern part of the city, and only enough buildings that were actually needed. They're all fully occupied. Even those that are under construction at the moment are already 80% let. If you're going to build tall, build in clusters and do it where there's good communications and where there's a great desire to be accommodated. Looking around London, I think Christopher Wren would agree that what is going on in many other parts of London is currently a disaster. What you're seeing at Vauxhall Cross, for instance, what's happening in large parts of Docklands, where they've stopped building office buildings at Canary Wharf and they're now only building high-rise residential. We're now the target of an unstoppable wave of international investment looking for trophy apartments in London. These are piles of safe deposit boxes, they're not homes. And we're losing our skyline for no benefit. We need homes, we need offices, we don't need negative investment. Russian money being washed, Chinese money gambling on London, Middle Eastern money looking for safety, all pouring into London, into apartments that are bought, furnished, locked and left empty. Large parts of London are being turned into ghost towns with skyscrapers in them. That's something we should all be very concerned about, and I'm sure that's something on which Christopher Wren and I could agree. Over the years, erroneously, I've been compared with Christopher Wren on a number of occasions. Equally, I've been compared with the Luftwaffe. So maybe I stand somewhere in between. Wren built a great cathedral. I'm pleased to say I gave the city a great space. I'm very grateful for your attention and very keen to receive your questions. Thank you very much.
Can I ask, is this working, or shall I?
Oh, no, it is.
Let me ask a first question, Peter, which is, New York's quite a successful city. It has a grid. It's not medieval. How do you find that as a place?
I find it a little too intense, and the bits of New York I've always enjoyed most are the bits that the grid missed, or the bits where the grids collide. There are even places in Paris I enjoy. They're the bits that Haussmann never got hold of. When you manage to get round the back of those great boulevards, Paris is a fantastic city. But it's the less planned bits that give me the greatest pleasure. So when you get south of Midtown in New York and all the grids start to collide, I think in the Chelsea district, for instance, I think New York gets really interesting. And when you get to downtown, you have an almost medieval street pattern, albeit with skyscrapers in the middle. But very narrow roads, and it becomes, to me, much more interesting. Yes, I can enjoy the excitement of New York, and there are places where building tall is the only option. If you're surrounded by water, as New York is, if you're only 1 square mile, as the City of London is, Canary Wharf, again, surrounded by water, if it's Hong Kong, where there's not much flat land to build on, the only answer is to build vertically. But that's not true in most places. People either build tall because they've run out of land, or they build tall because they have a huge inferiority complex. And sadly, it's too often the latter. The Elephant and Castle is no better for having a tall building. Until they get rid of the traffic gyratory and deal with the Aylesbury estate, it won't change.
One other one, Canary Wharf, I suppose, emerged not so much as a rival to the city, but an alternative to Croydon for back office space. And I was very interested in your comment that thus far it's been more of a development than a place. Now, you're a professor of place at the Bartlett. Were you the planner for the next 20 years for Canary Wharf? What is it that you do to make a development into a place? It has quite a lot of people. It's doing a lot of residential development, some of which may be for people who actually live there. Are there formulae that you could use as a planner to make it a kind of more of a living part of London?
Yes, I think so. And interestingly, there's a parallel. The mayor of La Défense, and I didn't realize La Défense had a mayor, but of course every area of Paris has to have its own mayor, came to visit me in the city about 6 months ago, lamenting the fact that La Défense didn't seem to be a direct competitor with the City of London. And I had to explain to him that really his product was much more like Canary Wharf. But to be fair, he was very keen to understand how it could change. And I said to him, well, have you thought of trying to import a lot of the Paris nightlife into La Défense to set a party going? Because that's what will help to tend to help to make the place. If the people working in Canary Wharf stay on and play there in the evening, then it'll start to come alive. One of the things I would do at Canary Wharf is to take out most of the car parking, make people travel there by public transport. Somehow, if people travel together in public transport, they start to become more of a population rather than a set of individuals in bubbles. And the problem with Canary Wharf is people arrive and leave from underground car parks. And I think that takes away from the sense of place. People often suggest that the best way to create a place is to bring residents into a business district. Now, that hasn't worked at Canary Wharf. Most of the people who have apartments at Canary Wharf travel so much and they're not at home very much, and it doesn't add much to the sense of place. So lots of apartments, but not many people home. The City of London, we took the line that it was better to introduce nightlife with business activity side by side. After all, residents don't like nightlife. Business and nightlife work together perfectly well at different times of the day and night. And you can have the best of both worlds by limiting residents in the city and locating them in certain areas where you can protect their amenity. So the idea of mixed use in planning is that you've got to get the right mixture for the particular place. It's not always the same mixture.
Any questions from the floor or observations that you'd like to respond from Peter on? We've covered quite a lot of ground. Yes, please. There's a mic coming just to you. Yeah. Tell us who you are.
Okay. Love the lecture. I thought it was really quite personal when you talk about place rather than so much development. I'm very curious, just a quick question on your own opinion, especially working in the planning office over Battersea Park, which, if anything, is starting to show signs of very much being a development rather than, so much a very active look at creating a new place within a sort of outskirts of the central city.
That's very, very perceptive, because that's one of those areas I was worrying about towards the end of my talk. If you see me look over my shoulder quite a lot at the moment, it's because I keep getting texts from the developers of Vauxhall 9 Elms, following a piece I did on the BBC London News a couple of weeks ago, indicating that the Vauxhall development certainly wasn't place and was a collection of the sort of investment apartments I've been talking about. I'm very worried by what's happening in that part of London. If you take a boat upriver on a winter's evening when it's getting dark, past Chelsea Harbour and Imperial Wharf on the north bank of the river, you won't find many lights on. There aren't many people home. And I'm worried that the Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea development on the other side of the river will be very much the same. It's a sort of a ghost town development. Yes, they'll all be sold. There'll be no difficulty at all. They tend to sell them off plan in Hong Kong to people whose concern is how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how much a square foot, and what's the view from the top of the tower. Less concern about how does it feel when you're at ground level walking through it, what's the sense of community, what are the local facilities. And because the affordable housing which planning authorities require tends to be built off-site, because the developers would rather not have those sort of people in their high-end development, it never does become a proper community. It never becomes a balanced community. There's never any life there. Simply getting in the likes of Norman Foster and Frank Gehry to design glitzy pieces of architecture in the middle of it won't make it into a place. That's just icing on top of something that isn't a cake. You might as well ice a block of polystyrene. It's not going to be very nice to eat. It's not going to be the sort of place people will choose to go. And I think the development industry is very cynical when they talk about that they're providing more homes for London. I don't blame the local authorities, boroughs like Wandsworth. They have to meet their housing targets that are set by the government and the mayor, and these units tick the box for housing targets. They have to balance their books because they're short of money, and the planning gain that they receive in return for the planning permissions helps them to balance their books. They want to achieve some social housing, and the only mechanism that's left is using planning gain from these commercial developments because local authorities can no longer afford to build social housing themselves. And the fourth reason is if a borough in London does refuse one of these developments, the government will override them on appeal, because there seems to be a perception from the mayor and the government that any development is good development, which I don't think is true. So if you're worried about that area and worried about the sense of place that it's going to develop, I would share your worry. It's interesting, since the short piece on television, I've been contacted by groups trying to protect Earl's Court from redevelopment, Mount Pleasant, Crystal Palace. There seems to be an awful lot of concern out there as to the role development is playing in reshaping London at the moment. I'm not sure whether the market economy hasn't got the upper hand at the moment. And it's very interesting that there's only one part of London where offices are still being built. That's in the city, because the city took steps to protect office development. Everywhere else, people are clamouring to build more and more of these trophy apartments.
Peter, can I just add to that and ask you, because it was done long before your time, but what you think of the Barbican? Some of the most significant 3 towers in the city of London actually commissioned, built directly by the city as a form at the time, a sort of odd form of council housing.
I think it's been very successful. It is very contained in one part of the city. It does have some high-rise living, and I'm not against having high-rise residential. There are some people who prefer to live in a tower. I don't want to appear a total hypocrite. I live on the 27th floor of the Heron in the city, right next door to the Barbican, have done for the last 6 months. I'm getting to enjoy high-rise living. But there are many people who don't want to live in high-rise blocks, and the important thing is to provide the right balance that will actually be occupied. The Barbican does have high levels of occupancy. I think it worked better when it was, as you described it, high-end council housing, when it was rented. And one of the things that's going wrong in London, and it's not just London, successive American and British governments have stigmatised rented housing. Democrat, Republican, Labour, Conservative, the message has gone out, if you don't own your home, you're not a stakeholder in society. That is not a good message for urban planning. You look at Paris, Berlin, Vienna, very successful cities where most people rent rather than own. Home ownership is fine once you get outside of the centres of great cities. But if you have a home ownership in the centres of great cities, you will have a high degree of under-occupation. Because the people who can afford to buy units in the centre of a great city don't come home very often. They're busy travelling, they're busy out enjoying themselves. So I think if we could move back to having a larger private rental sector, a well-managed rental sector, I'm not talking about individuals buying a few extra apartments and buy to let. I'm talking about a professional rented sector. Look at one of the most impressively managed parts of London, Marylebone. The Howard de Walden estate own it all. You can't buy a flat, you can't buy a house, you can rent. but they look after that area wonderfully. They even decide which shops should be in Marylebone High Street because they control the leases. I think that's a wonderful model. I'm not suggesting that's the perfect model for large parts of the East End, but you could adapt that model, and there's no reason at all why the private sector and developers can't make a profit out of providing homes to people without having to produce these boxes for sale.
Thank you. Yes, sir, just at the back there. There's a mic coming.
The corporation also built a global name tag.
Yes.
Originally named for, I think they effectively called it nurses and policemen. And it just makes me think, and I know this is back to moving away slightly from talking about Wren, what you describe is a very bleak future. And it's the people in the middle generally who are going to be squeezed out of those policemen and nurses, the people who contribute, who remain places. But it seems like we're helpless. I mean, is there any way around this where either developers go bust, get the land back, or there's some kind of, perhaps you just touched the nerve, but I think you said people don't touch it. People are saying enough's enough. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but if it doesn't, most people in this room and elsewhere, their children won't be living in London in 10 years' time.
You're quite right. London depends on attracting young people constantly. It depends on the turnover. It's a city. It's not a stable community. It's a transient community. But people have to be able to afford to live in it if they're going to play in it. And that's not simply people who are working in the insurance industry or bankers or lawyers or people with high incomes. It's to do with the people that run the place, as you say. You need your teachers, you need nurses, you need people to drive the buses. If you don't have them living close to the centre of London, those services will cease to operate and London will collapse. Which is another reason why I say that we do need this return to a good value rental sector and security of accommodation and a residential sector that's driven by supply and demand rather than the maximisation of profit and investment value. Housing has turned from a utility into a commodity. And it's not a very good commodity. Trying to make housing into gold bars isn't a very wise move. We all saw what happened when we had the mortgage-driven boom in the US and in this country, where people borrowed and borrowed in order to meet the strictures of the government that they should become stakeholders. The banks were very clever. They didn't lead this, it was the politicians led it, but the banks were very clever and invented ways to lend money to people that couldn't afford to pay it back. Now we all know what happened in the noughties. At the end of 2008, there was a banking crash, entirely based on that mortgage bubble. Now the worrying thing with the current bubble is there are no mortgages involved. This is a tsunami of international investment, almost without end, prepared to invest in London purely for its commodity value, as if they were buying gold bricks, gold bars. So however high the prices go, it will still be an asset. It doesn't matter whether people are being priced out of homes because they aren't being occupied. There are positive signs. There's a little development company called Pocket Living, run by a man called Mark Vlessing, building one-bedroom flats for sale at 20% below market value to people that are on the affordable housing register, like teachers and young doctors and nurses. And that model appears to work. It can be done even within Zone 1 and 2, close to underground stations, and there are projects that are being built in that way around London, but they're very, very small scale. There's no reason why that same model couldn't be adapted to rental property. It doesn't have to be for purchase. I think the important thing, and I was saying it to somebody that was very concerned about what's happening in Earl's Court only this morning, the important thing is that the various groups that are worried about what's happening in the different parts of London join together. I think this is something for people power. I think it is something where all of you who are concerned need to start saying so. I don't think a market-driven economy is what people really want. And I think politicians need to have to be made aware of that. I was distressed to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer talking about planning in the budget speech this year. He said the planning system would be further simplified. And I thought to myself, I didn't know the Chancellor was responsible for planning. I thought it was a chap called Pickles. And then I thought, hang on a minute, they sent him to sort out the floods. Maybe he didn't come back. He did float, don't worry. But the thought that the planning is now controlled by the Treasury as if it was a constraint on economic development, when in fact it's the one thing that manages to keep economic unconstrained development in check, is worrying. It was the same with Gordon Brown. He took control of planning when he was in the Treasury. It's the same under the current government. This isn't a party political point at all, but I do believe that national politics have lost any connection with what London needs. And I have to say, I don't think that either of the two elected mayors we've had in London, Ken and Boris, were both gung-ho for development. As long as there were cranes, they thought that was good. And I think it's quite important to see what the cranes are actually building. Remember, the value of the land is created by the planning permissions that are granted, that it isn't just made by the site that you buy. So I think the answer is in this and other rooms of people starting to question this.
Take one more question, just there.
And just going back to places like Vauxhall, Nine Elms, and this kind of rash of silos of investment. You said you don't blame the councils and the planners in places like Wandsworth. In which case, who do you blame? Is it down to the GLA and the fact that the London plan doesn't actually have any teeth?
It's partly the lack of teeth, and again, I've got some sympathy. The one thing I didn't mention was, of course, the British planning system, as many of you will know, is the reverse of the system used in the rest of the world. The British planning system is based entirely on precedent. It's a reactive system, not a proactive one. Now, that's fine in terms of adapting to something like the Big Bang in the City of London, being able to change direction quite suddenly. It's not so good in terms of resisting an uncontrolled development boom, because there isn't a master plan against which to measure things. So I do think there is a need for more controls. It would help to have more protected views in London, because as I said earlier, those constraints posed by the views of St Paul's helped us enormously to shape the city and to ensure that our cluster was a tight cluster and in the eastern part of the city. Equally, the flight path into City Airport set a cap of 300 metres on the top of them, and that was very helpful again, because left to themselves, the developers would have gone twice as high. I think we do need more planning constraints in London. I think, first of all, we need an appreciation that the important thing in London is to protect and grow communities and create new communities. There are wonderful examples in London of what the GLC did in the 1970s in places like Vauxhall Bridge Road, where they created what I would call donuts rather than towers. They built new developments that filled whole blocks with residential accommodation, leaving a nice space in the middle where you could have mature landscape. I took the film crew into one the other day to show them what a real place could be like. It's only been there since the 1970s, but within minutes of going into that space and seeing the little allotment, the rose garden and the mature trees, elderly ladies were coming up to us wanting to know what we were filming. And I suggested to a number of them that they might like to swap their flat for the penthouse in St George's Tower at Vauxhall. And they turned back to me as if I was mad and said, no, they said, this is a place. They said, this is a community. That won't be a community. And I thought, well, if 70-year-old ladies can get it, why can't the mayor?
Lovely note to end on.